Welcome to Masters of Regeneration Radio. Conversations with humans who dare to reimagine our place on planet Earth. Earth is changing fast. Evolution happening in real time. An intimate, circular understanding of nature and living systems. We are the land. The land is us.
Hey everyone, this is episode 28 of Masters of Regeneration Radio, and this is your host, Tomas Reyes. First of all, happy 2020. It's been a while since our last episode. I've been basking in the deeply transformative power of the past 2-3 months. I hope you're all well and riding this collective upgrade that we're all experiencing. Our guest today is LARS CHITTKA. LARS is professor of Sensory and Behavioural Ecology at Queen Mary, University of London, and has been a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study in Berlin. His book, The Mind of the Bee, is forthcoming with Princeton University Press. So before we get started, I think there's a couple ways to see the world. In the first one, you are identified with yourself, with a capital S, whatever that means to you. But you're identified as you, and then there's the world around you, and the food, water, air, and critters, such as plants, animals, insects, and fungi, are stuff in nature, inanimate things that are there, and you don't think of them as beings just as complex as you, with emotions, intelligence, challenges. They're loving, they're scared, or they're even part of you. In the second view, you choose to see the world as teeming with life in myriad forms who are just as intelligent as you are. They have similar emotions, they are using all the tools available to them to make the best out of their time on Earth, and they have different perception tools we do not understand, such as other sound and light frequencies. And they are inextricably linked to who you are as a life form. Everything alive, ripe with knowledge, emotions, and the power of choice. Here's an excerpt from an article that Lars co-authored. All the links will be on the show notes of episode 28 on mastersofregeneration.com. So come visit. If you're enjoying the show, remember, it means a lot to us if you share on social media, on your stories on Instagram and everywhere. Just let us know how you're enjoying this content. So insects, such as bees and ants, are often held up as the epitome of the robotically mechanistic approach to animal nature. Scientists have long known that these creatures must possess a large behavioral repertoire in order to construct their elaborate homes, defend against intruders, and provision their young with food. Yet, many still find it plausible to look at the bees and ants as little more than reflex machines, lacking an internal representation of the world or an ability to foresee even the immediate future. In the absence of external stimuli or internal triggers, such as hunger, it's believed that the insect's mind is dark and its brain is switched off. But perhaps the problem is not that insects lack an inner life, but that they don't have a way to communicate in terms we can understand. It is hard for us to prise open a window into their minds. So maybe we misdiagnosed animal brains as having machine-like properties simply because we understand how machines work, whereas to date, we have only a fragmentary and imperfect insight into how even the simplest brains process, store, and retrieve information. And we can change the word information, we can exchange it with memories, right? However, there are now many signs that consciousness-like phenomena might exist not just among humans or even great apes, but that insects might have them too. Not all of these lines of evidence are from experiments specifically designed to explore consciousness. In fact, some have lain buried in the literature for decades, even centuries, without anyone recognizing their hidden significance. Consciousness, and to the Western world, and I'm personally adding this since to ancestral cultures around the world, it's a different story. So consciousness then is an evolutionary invention like wings or lungs. It's useful to us. It's therefore most likely to be useful to other organisms with traits deeply homologous to ours. They share with us the difficulties of moving, probing the environment, remembering, predicting the future, and coping with unforeseen challenges. If the same behavioral and cognitive criteria are applied to much larger brain vertebrates, then some insects are likely to qualify as conscious agents. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Here we go. This is episode 28 of Masters of Regeneration Radio with LARS CHITTKA, and this is your host, Tomas Reyes. Remember, all the notes and some cool videos of the bees doing whatever Lars is asking them to do will be on the show notes on episode 28 of Masters of Regeneration Radio on our website, mastersofregeneration.com. Here we go.
Okay. How's Bogota? I've never been to Bogota.
Have you been to Colombia at all, or not really?
I haven't, no.
It's some days it's wonderful, some days it's really gray and cold. Because it's really high up. This is high mountain wetland.
It's very, very high.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's 2,600 meters. And it's, we're basically in Bogota surrounded by mountains with a lot of springs and a lot of water. So it's very moist and it's very cold.
Okay.
When it's sunny, it's wonderful. But it's not sunny very often. So.
Okay. What's the altitude? It's pretty high in the mountains, isn't it?
Yeah, it's 2,600 meters. So.
Okay.
You do meters, right, in England?
Yeah. Well, not. I'm not English, so.
Yeah.
They do feet around me, but I'm German, so I'm fine with meter.
Gotcha. It's, were you in London or where are you again?
Yes, I'm based in London. Uh-huh.
You are. All right. Yeah. But the good thing is here in Bogota, you can drive an hour out of the city and you're in warmer climate. So it's really nice.
Okay.
It's important to get out of the city often.
Right.
Yeah. And so as you can probably hear, I'm coming out of a terrible cold. I don't get sick very often, but last Monday I just went down.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Mm.
But we'll make it work.
Mm-hmm. So where are you from originally?
All over the place. I was actually born here.
Okay.
But
okay.
Yeah, but on my dad's side of the family, we're Lebanese.
Okay.
And when I was 4, I moved with my mom to Paris, and so I grew up in France.
Okay.
And on my mom's side of the family, we're Portuguese and Spanish, and mixed with indigenous from here, and then
Okay.
Have lived all over the place in Brazil, in Tokyo, in New York, in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. How about yourself? You're German. And
I'm culturally German, so that's where I grew up. But I'm genetically Eastern European, so I have no German genes whatsoever.
Oh, really? Did you do 23andMe or one of those?
Yeah, my sons gave me one of these ancestry DNA kits,
Gotcha.
and
I did it.
No trace of anything Germanic.
Well, your culture becomes your biology, doesn't it?
I guess largely, but then for the last 20 or so years, I've lived abroad as well, so.
Exactly. So you're part. Yeah, I did 23andMe, and genetically, it's a mess. It's a big mix. There's some, on top of the ones I already mentioned, I'm also sub-Saharan African and Cambodian and Chinese and
Okay.
indigenous and Native American and Italian, and it's just like, all over the place.
Okay.
Yeah, very busy,
Yeah,
busy genes.
Okay. All right.
Moved around a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I love that idea of thinking I'm all those things genetically, but we're also what our different experiences of cultures make us, right? So.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, the experience was sort of the inverse, in that my genes are very neat and tidy, except Surprisingly, there are no German genes inside of me. So,
Yeah. Yeah. But you grew up there up until you were an adult, or?
yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what made you get interested in consciousness in nature, namely bees and bumblebees?
Okay.
Did you grow up in a forest, or what's your life story that's led you to kind of be fascinated with that
That's a
intelligence?
curious question. So, I think I came to bees more or less by accident, in that I was actually keen to move to Berlin. I grew up in a really small, boring provincial town in North Germany, and then moved to another small, boring provincial town in North Germany, Göttingen, to study. And then I was attracted to what was then West Berlin, an island in the middle of communist Eastern Europe. I asked a professor in Göttingen what he thought of this idea to discontinue my studies in Göttingen, move to West Berlin, and there was sort of a sharp intake of breath. And then basically he said that's career suicide, and the university there is terrible, and they're famous for nothing but socialist activities and so on. And then he scratched his head a little bit and said, "Oh well, but there's one lab working on bees. They're pretty good. You might want to try them." And so that's how I started with bees. But things like consciousness weren't very much on the agenda then. I guess my team and others viewed insects. There was a considerable fascination with social insect behavior and the diversity of their behaviors and the clever buildings that they constructed and so on. Mm. But there wasn't an appreciation that they were particularly intelligent.
Yeah.
And that sort of changed over the course of my work and that of others in related laboratories. So one discovery in the early 90s was that we discovered that bees can count. And that was a surprise.
Wow.
At the time, so we knew already that they can navigate very well, that they can remember where their hive is located, and of course from large distances, so they fly up to 10 kilometers away from their hives, that they could find their way back, so they had to remember it. We also knew that they could remember flower colors and scents and so on. But all this learning behavior seemed pretty much embedded in their natural foraging routines as individuals that needed to remember their home and also their food sources.
Yeah.
But once we discovered that they can solve a kind of intelligence test that is actually quite unrelated to their natural foraging behavior, so these counting tasks were a bit of a surprise, and that, I guess, opened a big can of worms in terms of what other clever things they might be able to do.
How do you define intelligence?
Well, I guess it's a type of, it comprises problem-solving skills that are not given to you from birth, that involve learning, that involve tasks that you can't do by default, that you have to somehow invest some brain work into solving. And so in that sense, intelligence is different from the many kinds of behaviors that we also see in the animal kingdom that are sometimes very impressive in terms of, say, if you look at the nest construction skills of birds, for example, then there might be very elaborate constructions, but they're largely driven by instincts.
Yeah.
And so intelligent behavior in animals then is something where instinct doesn't help you. It involves problems that you haven't necessarily encountered in your evolutionary past, but that you have to solve as an individual.
And that's the kind of test that you gave the bees or the bumblebees.
that's the kind of test that we typically confront our bees with. So the idea is to confront them with tasks that they wouldn't typically have been encountering in their day-to-day lives over millions of years in their evolutionary history. And so of the more recent kinds of intelligence tests that we ran by our bees were a so-called string pulling task, where if you use that test on other animals, typically, and that is a test that has been historically used on corvid birds or primates, where you essentially have to pull a string to get access to an object that's otherwise out of reach. And in our case, that was an artificial flower that was presented under a glass screen, and the only way to get to it was to pull on a string that was attached to that flower. And these artificial flowers contained a little reward in the form of a droplet of sugar water, which is typically what our bees like to get if they've done something right.
Yeah.
And not only did the bees learn that just fine to pull on these strings, but they were also able to learn these tasks by just observing other individuals that were already skilled in the task. So without some kind of trial and error learning, these individuals just watched what a skilled bee did with the string attached to the flower and then was able to do it by itself.
Yeah. Do you have videos of that?
Sorry?
Do you have a video of that you can? Oh,
yeah,
sweet.
I can send you.
You can send me some links and we can put them up on the episode.
Yes.
On our website. Yeah. That's great.
And then we took that a step further in that we presented the bees with a kind of simple tool use task. And the tool in this case was a little ball. So they essentially had to move a ball to a target.
I'm sorry.
A goal.
Sorry, sir.
No. The bees had to roll a ball to a goal, a defined area on a horizontal surface in order to get their little sugar rewards. And so in this case, unlike the string pulling task, this was a detached object. It was pretty much like using a token in a vending machine, for example.
Okay.
And so they had to take the ball and move it to a defined target area. And again, in a similar manner to the string pulling task, if you paired a skilled individual with a naive observer, the observer was able to learn it just by watching, essentially, the skilled individual. But in this case, there was something else that made the observational learning particularly interesting. And this was that we played a little trick on this pair of skilled bee, naive bee, by making the skilled individual solve the task in a suboptimal manner. And this is how we did that. We had 3 balls that were each at a different distance to the goal area. Now, obviously, the best way to solve that task is to take the closest ball and move that one to the target area, right? Because that's the shortest distance. But the skilled individual had learned that the 2 closest balls actually can't be moved, so they're glued down.
Okay.
That skilled individual knew only ever to pick the furthest ball and move that to the target area.
I have a question though. How did you ask the bee to please take the ball to the, how do you train the bee to do the task you want?
We have to train them. And we do that in a stepwise manner. Either we move the ball, so we could do that by, for example, using a little magnet underneath the arena and having a little bit of metal in the actual ball. So we actually move the ball ourselves from underneath as if it's moved by a ghost. And once it's in the target area, the bee gets a reward.
And she's just observing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A slightly more efficient way is to use a dummy bee. So essentially a plastic bee that shows where the ball needs to be moved, but the best way to train a novice bee is to pair her up with a skilled live individual. So that has the greatest credibility, I guess. Mm-hmm.
That's great. Isn't that how we learn when we're kids, watching our parents and all the adults around, do life, and we just imitate, right?
Yeah, to a large extent.
Yeah.
Forms, of course, quite a bit of the human cultural upbringing. But I guess the surprise for us was that you could see similar kind of observational learning in something as small-brained as an insect. So they have very, very small but very sophisticated brain. But to come back now to your question about consciousness. So one of the aspects of this particular study that was particularly surprising was when we played this particular trick on the interaction between the skilled bee and the naive bee by demonstrating to the naive individual a suboptimal way of solving the task. So this skilled individual always picked the furthest ball and moved that to the target area. Mm-hmm. And we showed that to the naive bee 3 times and then put the naive individual on the spot and asked her, well, okay, how would you solve the task now that there's no skilled bee present? And so a stupid copier, one that would just ape what they've seen the skilled bee do, would just also pick the furthest ball and move that to the target area. But that's not what that naive bee did. Instead, she always picked the closest ball and moved that to the target area.
Just to check that the most efficient path to the reward, basically, or
she found the most efficient path to the target area, and that indicates to us not directly necessarily consciousness, but some sort of awareness of the desired outcome. Yeah. She didn't simply copy what she'd seen the other bee do, but there must have been some sort of appreciation, a kind of mental sort of extrapolation to, okay, what do I ultimately want to achieve here? What's the goal? Rather than just copying the other bee, and in that way come up with a better solution than what they had seen the demonstrator, the skilled individual do.
That's great.
And so this is what we mean by an exploration of consciousness. It's at its very basic level, some sort of evidence that the bee or any insect is not just stuck in the moment, not just driven by external stimuli that it's currently exposed to. So you face the animal with stimulus X and it does something predictable. That's the old-fashioned view of insects as a reflex machine. But this kind of intelligence test indicates to us that there is some sort of offline processing that's not directly driven by current external stimuli, but some sort of simple thought process of going, okay, I need to solve this task. How do I get there? What can I do to make it optimal? And so that is a kind of indication that there is some sort of offline thinking in the mind of a bee.
So would you say... Sorry?
You look like you have a question before I waffle on.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking, would you say that intelligence in a way, we could say intelligence is the ability to make choices as life is happening to them, from in circumstances that they haven't experienced before, it's making choices. Is that a trait of intelligence?
It depends a little bit on how you define choices. So of course, lots of living beings make some sort of choice at some level. So if you give a growing plant the option between an area that's artificially dimmed and one that's brightly lit, then it will grow towards the light, not the darkness. Is that a choice? Not sure. So I think I think it's a little different in these kinds of tasks that we're presenting these kinds of intelligence tests that we're presenting our animals with, and that these are tasks that no individual in the evolutionary history of that species has ever encountered before. So you have to, in some cases, solve it by not just some form of learning, but actually in some cases by some form of insight or projection into the near future to get the right solution.
A level of improvisation in a way. So, okay.
Yeah, but mental exploration rather than just trial and error. So I think the remarkable thing with these particular tasks is, yes, you can get the bees to learn to manipulate objects by them just fiddling with them. But in this particular experiment, for example, the naive individuals had no prior experience with moving goals to targets. They only observed the skilled demonstrator and nonetheless spontaneously found a better solution to the task than what they'd seen the demonstrator do.
Wonderful. How do bees see the world?
Very differently from us. In many different regards. So first of all, the colors that they see are very different. Bees can see ultraviolet light, so shorter wavelengths than violet light, the kinds of light that gives us suntan or sometimes sunburn, but we can't see it. On the other hand, they can't see as far into long wavelengths as we can, so they can't see red as well. And some shades of red for them are simply black. So their whole visual spectrum is shifted to shorter wavelengths. But in addition, they can see polarized light. So you might recall from physics lessons that light has some wave properties, so it swings in a particular direction, not other directions. We can't see that, but bees can. Wow. And that's tremendously useful because the direction, the orientation of polarized light in the sky actually serves as a compass cue that can tell you which direction is north and south and so on. And so for long distance navigation, it's tremendously useful.
Wow, that's awesome.
It is, yeah. And there's one aspect where bees are clearly much worse than humans are, and that's their visual spatial resolution. So they can see a lot fewer pixels. As a rough rule of thumb, their vision is around 100 times worse than our own in terms of the spatial detail that they can resolve. So the number of pixels is very low. They compensate to some extent by being able to see very fast.
Okay.
So they can process more frames per second than humans can. That's also the reason, for example, why it's often difficult to catch flies or to slap them, because their vision is extremely high speed.
Is that most insects?
It's most insects, but flies seem to hold the record, to my knowledge.
Wow.
But bees are a lot faster than humans.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. How does polarized light look like? What are they looking at? What are they seeing?
It's, well, I guess a fundamental problem that we as researchers face is that you don't know how anything looks from the cockpit of any other animal. So in the same way as I can't know how red looks to you from inside your mind, you might have sensed something completely different. We just call it the same because we've been told to call it the same.
Yeah.
So formally we can't know what it feels like to see polarized light from inside the head of a bee. But you can of course use equipment to visualize the pattern of polarized light in the sky, and it's essentially arranged in concentric rings around the sun, where the weakest polarization is near the sun, and the highest degree of polarization is about 90 degrees from the sun, but the whole pattern is one of rings around the sun, essentially. And so even if under conditions where if you want to use the sun for a compass cue, Then, of course, the problem is that the sun's often hidden behind clouds or mountains or forests or just below the horizon. And in such cases, you can use the distribution of polarized light in the sky to reconstruct the position of the sun.
That's wonderful.
And that's what bees do. Mm-hmm.
Do you have an image of that as well? Or a construction of an image of that?
Yes, I can send you some. Okay, well, I should take some notes.
Okay.
So you wanted string pulling video?
Oh yeah, it would be wonderful to have those videos and an image of this. Just because, so much easier to illustrate concepts and things with images and stories.
Right.
So, of course, we humans cannot get into other animals' minds and see how they see, but how have you arrived at these insights that, they see polarized light or they see very fast? All of that is through equipment, because I guess do you know what a red flower with yellow petals look like to a bee, for example?
Well, again, we can't know what it looks like, but we can test whether, for example, two colors are distinguishable or not, and the extent to which they're similar, and so on. So, for example, we can compare two yellow flowers, one of which, in addition to having a yellow reflectance, also has ultraviolet reflectance. Now, such flowers exist, and they do look identical for humans. We cannot distinguish them because we can't see the ultraviolet component, but we can, of course, test whether bees can discriminate. And the way we typically go about that with artificial flowers and controlled setups is we train the bees. So we give them a reward if they choose a particular target.
I'm sorry.
We give the bees a reward for choosing a particular target and no reward or something they don't like bitter tasting substances if they get it wrong. And so in that way, when we train bees in that way, we can discover, for example, that some shades of far red, long wavelength red, are indistinguishable for black. So these are two very different stimuli for us. For a bee, they can't discriminate them because they don't see very well in the red. Mm-hmm. At the other end of the spectrum, like a UV filter, for us looks just black because we can't see the ultraviolet. So if we confront a human with black glass and a UV filter glass, same thing. They can't discriminate them. But if we give a bee that sort of discrimination and one of these two is associated with reward and the other is not, they get it reliably right with very, very high levels of accuracy. Mm-hmm. So it's these kinds of tests that we can do. We can ask, can the bee see something that we cannot? Can they make these discriminations? We can even get quantitative data about how similar exactly two stimuli are subjectively. But we cannot, of course, look inside the bee's head and see what do you actually experience when seeing these colors.
Yeah. Wonderful. Do you have a specific intention in mind when you're like a desired objective of doing all this research to understand these animals, these bees and what's, I have a particular view. I think that, the more we understand other living beings, the more we can respect and protect and, understand them, because mm-hmm. we no longer see them as some things that, are that we're completely disconnected from. And that's why I find it important, because then, we understanding that we depend a lot on all these pollinators, for example.
Yes.
But
well, there are many types of motivations. There are just, from my point of view, that's a highly subjective point of view. They're just endlessly fascinating. Nobel laureate Carl von Frisch once compared bees to a kind of magic well, in a sense that the more you find out about them, the more questions arise, and then you find even more discoveries and so on. And he expressed that view in, I think, the 1960s, and I think we would still subscribe to that. And so they're just very fascinating in themselves, but that might be someone interested in rat cognition might say that about his animals as well. So that's an objective scale. So there are multiple other things that motivate us. One, of course, is that from a computational point of view, it's very intriguing how you can do so much with such a tiny brain. And so that's interesting for engineering people who are trying to find minimal computational solutions for unmanned aerial vehicles that can reliably navigate and recognize things in the world out there and so on. It's staggering just what diversity of tasks an insect can solve, and we're way behind with the kind of technology and finding forms of miniaturization that could compete with that. But yes, the other major applied factor that you mentioned is that the more I'm learning about bees, the more I guess I'm starting to scratch my head whether there isn't a very good reason perhaps to conserve them that's quite different from those that are usually highlighted in the media. So the media currently are very keenly aware that there is a problem with pollinators worldwide, that excessive pesticide use as well as habitat destruction combined with global warming has put many species of bees at peril. And this in turn generates a risk to food security, because one third of the food we consume is contingent upon the services of pollinators. So the vast majority of fruits and vegetables need pollination by insects, otherwise there's no fruit. And the problem expands even further if you consider that much of the food that we grow for cattle, such as clover, for example, also it depends on pollination. So no bees, no clover, no cattle, and so on. All of these things could be still had, but much more expensively. So, but that's a very human-centered view of asking the question of why we need to conserve bees. And when you think about the conservation of sort of charismatic mammals, the reason why people wish to conserve Siberian tigers and so on is often a very different one. It's not that we need them for our food, but we somehow sympathize and empathize with them because we think that they might consciously experience their own demise and their habitat destruction and so on. And for that reason, think that they're worth conserving. Whereas the perspective with pollinating insects is often, well, we sort of need them. That's why we need to conserve them, but not one that empathizes with them and so on. And the more we've learned about the fascinating mental lives, if you wish, of bees in recent years, the more that viewpoint changes, at least to my mind, so that when you actually appreciate that they are, however short-lived they are beings with kind of autobiographical memories that are not just clever, but also have emotion-like states and, of course, fear-like states and so on. That there is a wholly new perspective on why we perhaps shouldn't spray so many toxic substances at them, and also a sort of broader need for their conservation that actually derives from our insights into their mental lives.
Yeah, that's interesting. I see many, there's more and more people understanding the role of certain species and how important they are for our own survival, right? Not only, well, bees because we need them, and predators because they might maintain the health of the ecosystems they live in, and so on and so forth. But to go back to this idea of recognizing, it's like, to go back to what you were saying about how they see what they see that we don't see, do they communicate in sound at all, or is it mostly dance and because I remember reading in your article this wonderful part where you were talking about how the scout bee goes, and when she comes back, she starts doing this dance and showing the other bees where the flowers are, and just by doing this symbolic sort of geometric dance of and so the idea of how other organisms communicate just fascinates me. I love languages, so I always think, when you arrive in China, if you don't speak Chinese, well, you're completely lost, but then you're like, oh, they're humans, so they're probably just smart. I just don't speak their language. But what if, we could understand other beings, other organisms on the planet just like that, right? Just like trees move more slowly and communicate differently in ways we don't hear, or elephants communicate in sounds we can't hear either, and so on and so forth. Right?
Yeah. So I think one of the fascinating aspects of the bee communication system is just how profoundly different it is from any kind of communication that we can easily relate to.
Yeah.
So, as you said, it's a kind of ritualized, repetitive motor display that symbolizes to other bees the direction and distance of a food source.
Wow.
And so they're using repeated body movements inside the darkness of the hive that use, in that darkness, gravity as a reference to tell other bees where food is at several kilometers distance outside the hive, where they're using the sun compass as a reference. So it's a very...
What?
It works around multiple
so different
corners. Yes. I guess it's very, very distinct from searching for the rudiments of some form of human vocal communication in the animal kingdom. So people who look at primates get excited by the fact that some species of monkeys use alarm calls that are distinct for different types of predators. So a snake elicits a different kind of call from them than, say, an eagle, for example, which in a sense is interesting, but it's sort of looking for rudiments of human speech, basically. It's looking for something that we can relate to in some sort of simpler version. But the fascinating thing for me with, for example, bee communication is that it's a completely different pathway to conveying information to others in your group.
Yeah, it's a completely different language with a different structure. And can we go back to what you were saying about the dance inside the dark hive?
Right.
Using gravity as a reference?
Yes.
Can you expand on that?
Yes. So again, I think I should probably send you some figures. So the dance has essentially consists of a so-called waggle run where the bee moves a few centimeters straight ahead. On the vertical comb, so this is the wax comb is always vertical inside the hive, and the bee runs a few centimeters straight ahead, then makes a half circle to the starting point of that run, runs the same straight ahead path in the same spot, does a half circle to the other side, and then again the same straight ahead waggle run. And it's this waggle run where she sort of moves her abdomen from side to side that is the most important part. It's always connected with these half circles, but let's for the moment just focus on this straight ahead movement. So the whole movement has a kind of figure 8 shape, where the sort of the middle of the figure 8, the waistline, if you wish, is a little extended. So the extended waistline of the 8 is that waggle run. Mm-hmm. And so this waggle run is always repeated in the same direction within one dance for a bee that wants to indicate the same direction. So let's say the bee moves in that waggle run 3 centimeters straight up, right?
Yeah.
So it's away from the pull of gravity, straight up. If she moves straight up inside the hive, that indicates to other bees that they should fly in the direction of the sun outside the hive. So inside, it means if a bee walks straight up away from gravity, that tells other bees fly to the sun.
Gotcha.
If, on the other hand, the waggle run is straight down, so the bee moves downwards, mm-hmm. that tells other bees fly away from the sun.
Okay.
And any angle in between works in the same way. So if the dancing bee walks 90 degrees to the right of the direction of gravity, that tells other bees fly 90 degrees to the right of the sun. And it's 45 degrees amazing. Relative to gravity. It means fly 45 degrees to the right of the sun.
That's wonderful. And obviously this is connected to the polarized light that they see and all the, they're powerful navigators, essentially connected to what they see coming off the sun, the polarized light.
Exactly. So even if the sun itself is not currently visible, they can still reconstruct its position from the pattern of polarized light to get it correctly.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
That experience of being so connected to all the elements that are available for you to participate in life on the planet, right? As a bee. Yeah. Most people, most people in the city probably have no idea how to, navigate just by looking at the sun, right?
Yes. So I think
we have other tools, but
well, now of course we do have other tools by way of sat navs. Even before we did, of course, navigation in cities is much easier than natural environments for the simple reason that buildings in cities are often deliberately constructed to be unique and memorable. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, is different to, say, the million trees that might grow in a bee's flight range, for example. If you're, say, walking through a tropical forest or flying as a bee through a tropical forest, then lots of things actually look the same, unlike cities. And in such an environment, to navigate without a physical compass or a guide or a map is not a trivial task, especially if you have a brain the size of a pinhead.
Yeah. So, intelligence or consciousness, or I don't know, do you distinguish them? And they do not depend, whether we distinguish them or not, they don't really depend on brain size, essentially.
We don't know. We don't have a very good answer to that question. So we don't really know what the minimum mechanistic requirements are for a phenomenon like consciousness. We don't, so far, of course, even in humans, the neural correlate of consciousness hasn't been found. We don't know how it's implemented on a neural circuit level. So we can't say minimal consciousness requires 100,000 neurons or 10 million neurons.
Yeah.
So there's no clear idea of how large a brain you minimally need for having a conscious appreciation of your world. So all we can do at the present stage is we use psychological work, behavioral work, in which we confront bees or other animals with various tasks that would be very difficult, if not impossible, to solve without some form of awareness of the world around them. I think there is a difference between how we generally regard consciousness and intelligence. So I think consciousness has presumably in most animals an emotional content, a kind of subjectivity attached to different environmental stimuli. So you're not just responding to challenges in intelligent manners, but you also attach an emotional content to them of which you're aware.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess you can get machines to do many kinds of intelligent things, including chess and so on, without there being any evidence that they're actually aware of what they're doing. So there is a difference there.
Mm.
And it might well be that certain forms of intelligence require really large brains or extensive neural circuits. But if you look at that question on a task-by-task basis, so what is the minimum brain circuitry required for task X, for example, an awareness of the outcomes of one's own actions, or for counting, and so on, then often the number of neurons that computer scientists come up with are staggeringly small. And so there's no obvious constraint of certain aspects of intelligence that you couldn't, for formal reasons, fit into a very small brain.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a favorite experiment that you did with bees that really blew your mind? You know, that you went, oh my God, this is so wonderful. You know, or are all of them kind of like the pull a string one? And are you constantly experiencing this wonder of just observing?
Not constantly. There are obviously some highlights, and some of them I've already listed.
Yeah.
And so I mean, the string pulling study was a complete gamble in that I had a number of colleagues in my department who work on primates and clever large-brained birds and so on. And so they face their animals with exactly these kinds of tasks. And I guess we sort of jokingly had these interactions, but I think they sort of looked down on the kinds of intelligence tests we used to do with bees a little bit and said, well, but all these color learning tasks, that's really quite close to what a bee does in nature, because they have to be natural born color learners, because they have to learn which flowers are good and not so good and so on. And so at some point I just sort of flippantly remarked, well, I'm going to show you how they can do a string pulling task. And everyone in the room was like, yeah, right. And so I was quite aware that the chances were slim, but I had a postdoc at the time, Serval Lem, who was bold enough to say, okay, I'm going to give this a try. But
that's
yes,
awesome.
I remember when he first called me into the lab and said, it's working. I was sort of smashing that with my mouth. What? But yes.
That's amazing.
And I guess similarly with the counting experiment that we did in the early 90s, that was a kind of idea that came up over multiple glasses of whiskey in a pub. So we at the time did experiments on landmark learning in bees. So we trained them along sequences of very large tetrahedral tents. So they were 3.5 meter pyramid-shaped tents that we had put up to see how they would learn landmarks relative to the sun compass, especially if we produced a contradiction between learned landmarks and the sun compass. And one night after having several glasses of whiskey, me and my friend Carl, at the time we were fellow PhD students, came up with this idea: how about we get them to count these landmarks? And everyone was like, yeah, you guys are drunk. But we tried, and bees solved the task. And it was interesting because at the time we were doing field work. There was no internet. Well, there wasn't any internet, period, but there was no such thing as wireless internet. But we had no access to the literature, so we had no idea how counting experiments in animals were typically done. So we just did an experiment that no one had tried before, and sure enough, it worked quite well. So the bees were guided in their distance estimation by the number of landmarks that they had passed in flight. Yeah, so that was a big surprise. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. How do they count?
So in this particular experiment, they had to fly from their hive to a feeding station past 3 landmarks.
Okay.
Once they had learned that, 3 of these large tetrahedral tents, once they had learned that, we introduced a contradiction between the learned number of landmarks and the learned distance. So what we did was we just either increased the number of landmarks over the same distance or reduced it. Mm-hmm. And when we reduced it, many of the bees overshot the target and flew further than they had before, looking for the 3rd landmark. And when we had increased it, they were tricked to land at an earlier distance, thinking they'd already gone the right distance, even though they'd just flown past more landmarks than they had before. So the distance estimation was influenced by how many landmarks there were along the way.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
And also in that wonderful article that led me to reach out to you, you talked about bees displaying some optimistic or pessimistic, tendencies.
Yes.
How does that work?
So we essentially faced bees with a kind of glass half full, glass half empty task. So that's a kind of proverbial expression for looking at a situation that's actually 50-50, so it's neutral, but I guess someone who is an optimist might say that my glass is half full, whereas a pessimist says, oh, it's almost empty. So the situation there in the experiment is one that was actually borrowed from tasks that historically have been used for example, domestic animals to see whether they're in a happy state or a not so happy state. And this is how it works. So we train bees that, for example, the color blue is always associated with a reward, whereas the color green is always not associated with a reward. And the bee only ever gets to see one color at the time, and so it's a so-called go, no-go task. There's no choice. There's only one stimulus present. So after a while of learning that blue is good and green is really, there's no reward, it's not so good, they fly very fast to the blue option. Whereas if you give them only green, they know it's not rewarding, so they'll faff about for a long time, and after a long time they will go, okay, there's nothing else here, so I'll go and check out the green just in case maybe there is something. But what's different between the two options is a very long delay.
Okay.
For the negative option. They will eventually accept it, but only after a long hesitation. And then you give them an intermediate option. That's your half full glass. No, you give them an option that's turquoise, and you ask, how long does it take the bees to probe that option? And typically what happens is that bees will also accept the turquoise with some time delay that's intermediate between the option they know is bad and the very short delay with which they accept the good option. But interestingly, the readiness with which they accept the intermediate option, but the half full glass, depends on their on something that happened prior to the actual experiment. So if we give them a surprise reward prior to the experiment, just a tiny droplet of sucrose that they hadn't expected at that particular location because it's outside our setup, then they seem to be in a kind of optimistic state and will accept that intermediate option, that half full glass, so to speak, with much greater speed than they would otherwise if they had not had that surprise reward. Mm-hmm. So they behave as if they're optimistic in that state. And other researchers have done the inverse experiment where they've given the bees a little penalty before the setup. That is, they've just vigorously shook the bees, so they were a bit scared, in which case such intermediate options are accepted with a kind of pessimistic worldview where the bees hesitate more as if they had not been previously penalized. Wow. And it turns out that these emotional states also carry over to other behavioral contexts. So optimistic bees, those that have been receiving a surprise reward before an experiment, will also respond less adversely to a kind of simulated predator attack, where we briefly catch the bee and then ask how fast will she then subsequently return to normal flower visiting behavior. If they're in a kind of optimistic state, they'll do that faster even if they've been exposed to a predator attack.
Do you work
with... So they're really emotion-like states that are more than just an immediate trying to get away from an aversive stimulus, but that seem to affect multiple types of behaviors as if bees were either optimistic or pessimistic.
Do you work with generations of bees in the same family, like offspring of bees that you have previously trained?
We have done that in the past. And what's on your mind here? Maybe?
No, I was thinking maybe because I was thinking about the example you were saying about stressing the bee before she goes off to get the reward or not with the optimistic, view or not, and whether that has been passed or previous trainings are passed from one generation to the next.
Not so far as we know. But we haven't tried it. Yeah. So what we have done was that, for example, with the string pulling task, we inserted a single knowledgeable individual into a group of bees, and then the skills spread over multiple generations, so to speak, of learners, so that even after the original individual, they only lived for a few weeks, had died, the skill continued to spread to more learning generations. But in these cases, they were not true biological generations in a sense that one generation actually sired the offspring that then learned from the skilled individuals. They were just sequential sets of learners that picked up the skill. In a bumblebee's natural environment, it's relatively unlikely that the skill will persist over multiple generations because all individuals, with the exception of the new queens, die at the end of the summer in temperate habitats, that is. Mm-hmm. So only the queens overwinter, and they found their own colonies in the next spring. So in that sense, there's relatively little possibility for sequential worker generations to retain a skill. That might be different in tropical bumblebees, where there is no hibernation, and colonies sometimes persist for multiple years in the same location. So you might look for the native bees in your region, where in theory it's possible that there is a cultural retention of acquired skills over multiple generations.
Fascinating. Just to start wrapping up, I also wanted to see if we could talk a little bit about geometry. Like, why do bees choose to build the way they choose to build, as opposed to other forms?
Right. It depends on which bees we're talking about. Of course, different bees build very different constructions. Mm-hmm. So, familiar hexagonal honeycomb, that's exists in this form only in honeybees. Mm-hmm. And they, to the Americas, of course, have been introduced in multiple ways from the so-called Old World, and all species of honeybees. There's about 10 of them build these double-sided hexagonal comb constructions. Stingless bees, which are native to the Americas, also have very different, but often also very fascinating constructions. I don't know if you've seen some of these spiral-shaped constructions that stingless bees build, but
oh, I haven't. Are those the tiny ones, the Melipona something?
They're very varied in size. Some, like Melipona quadrifasciata, is actually not so much smaller than a honeybee, but other stingless bees, they come in sizes that are as small as fruit flies, basically. So they're fascinatingly small.
Yeah, because we have here in Colombia, there's a famous one they call them angel bee, and it's a very small, tiny stingless, and people say that the honey has amazing medicinal properties, and I don't know, but
that's undoubtedly plausible.
Yeah.
Honey is of course contains all kinds of things that make sure that there's no mold growing on them, so fungicides and bactericides, and so there are all kinds of substances that bees and other social insects make sure that their colonies aren't overgrown in fungus and bacteria and so on. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
But in some of the most, so I think the fascination historically with this hexagonal honeycomb is that it's mathematically very close to optimal in terms of minimizing the use of material while maximizing storage space. Mm-hmm. So every wall of every cell, of course, forms also the wall of the adjacent cells. And it's a much better way than building, say, square cells or circular cells where you lose lots of space in between. Yeah. You could, of course, with square cells and triangular cells, you wouldn't have any gaps in between, unlike circular cells, but you would also you can't really, it's not very clever to have square cells for larvae that are round, for example. Yeah. So the hexagonal solution is really mathematically optimal, and in that way it's impressive. But also the fact that the comb is double-sided, so the sides extend on both sides, makes it a very remarkable construction. But among these Latin American stingless bees, there are some constructions that are absolutely fascinating. So I don't know if you've heard of Partamona bees.
No.
So they excavate nests inside arboreal termite nests.
Okay.
So a small group of scout bees basically builds a sort of bridgehead on a termite nest, and then they build into these termite nests. They excavate them and build their colonies inside, which already is quite a military feat because the termites are quite well equipped to defend themselves and don't necessarily like intruders. So these bees build a very hard shell around their cavity as they expand it so the termites can't invade it.
Wow. What are they building that out of?
Sorry?
What are they building what kind of material are they using to build?
So they use tree resin, but they also use sand collected from nearby riverbanks.
Wow.
And so one of the most remarkable bees, they use only white river sand. They build very bright nest entrances that are basically funnel shaped using this white river sand.
Okay.
And so they're very bright signals that can be spotted from far away, but they're very hard constructions. They're sort of a funnel that leads inside the nest. And they use these funnels so they don't have to slow down before landing, because lots of birds and lizards try to catch bees when they land. Whereas these Partamona bees fly into these funnels at full speed and basically collide with the concave surface of the entrance and slide down inside the nest. Now, that's the external construction, but it gets even more bizarre as you go inside the nest.
Okay.
In that, the first nest chamber is actually a fake nest. Okay. And the fake nest is there because there are lots of other bees and also wasps, for example, that will try to rob the bees' nests because there's lots of nutrition in there. In fact, there is in Brazil, for example, there's a kleptoparasitic bee, so that does nothing but rob other bee species, does nothing but rob other nests.
Okay.
And so the Partamona defenses are against such robber bees, for example. Mm-hmm. They build a whole fake nest with diluted honey pots, so there's basically valueless honey, as well as fake brood chambers where there's actually no brood inside. And these fake nests contain not just valueless resources, but also a very large defense force.
Okay.
Of soldier bees that defend the colony. And only following a maze that you'd have to find your way through these. Remember, you're again in darkness. You're inside a termite nest. So only if some invader manages to penetrate the entrance as well as this fake nest do they get to the real nest.
Yeah.
And the real nest chamber, all the brood combs as well as the honeycomb are built on, they're not attached to the surface directly, but they're built on kind of stilts. So you'd have to actually find the stilts and walk your way up them to get to the actual resources, the honey and the nectar, which is very difficult in the dark, especially as, of course, the stilts are well defended again by defending bees. So it's a whole alien fortress, these constructions.
And that shape is the one you were saying that was the spiral shaped.
No, that's yet another species of stingless bees where they build these spiral shaped combs.
So this one is like a free form. They're
also horizontal combs, but they're built on these stilts or columns that are built through the nest.
That's amazing.
I can dig up some figures as well.
Oh, I'd love that. Thank you so much, Lars. Yeah, we'll put all that. So on top of all that, you also have a band and you make bee music or something like that.
So our first album is a kind of concept album where all the song lyrics are inspired in some way or another by the world of bees, but in a very metaphorical manner. So it's using basically bees as metaphors for human relationships, for example.
Very cool. Is that the link you sent me?
Yes. So the music is already on Bandcamp, but it should actually be on Spotify and iTunes and so on from tomorrow as well. So I can send you another link if that's more convenient.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I love this. This is so wonderful. And the more you learn, like you were saying, it's like an endless well of fascinating information on how they live and how they communicate, how they build. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your work. And
no problem.
And I'll keep you posted. And
all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be happy to see the final product.
For sure.
All right.
Okay. Lars. Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Have a good one.
All right then.
Bye-bye.
Bye.